She laughed when I told her I could cure her. A week later, she was up, and soon she was in jail. I was just an orderly, but I saw what her doctors didn't. This is a story about lies, arrogance, and the power of truth to shatter masks. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching from. I was never supposed to end up in a hospital basement, folding sheets and pushing stretchers for minimum wage. Not with the years I'd spent studying, not with the hands that once reset bones and stitched arteries with quiet precision. But life doesn't ask for your resume when it decides to break you. It simply picks the right moment, one that cuts the deepest and drives the knife in. Mine came the day they revoked my medical license and made sure I'd never wear a white coat again. The hallway buzzed faintly with the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, and I could hear someone coughing 2 rooms down. Somewhere upstairs, a code blue was called. I didn't flinch. That instinct, the one that made your heart race when a patient crashed, had been carefully drilled out of me. I had one job now: clean, carry, stay invisible. My name is Isaac Moorer. I'm 32 years old and I used to be a trauma physician. Now I mop floors in a city hospital in Detroit, wear scrubs the color of sadness, and take care of the only person in the world who hasn't turned her back on me: my aunt, Joan. Joan Moore is 68, a short, sharp woman with silver coils in her hair and eyes that have seen more truth than most textbooks ever dared to print. She used to be an obstetric nurse before arthritis twisted her joints and bureaucrats discarded her like an outdated chart. But her real power came from what people didn't put on paper. Her mother and her grandmother before that had been healers, women who knew the language of herbs and touch, of signs the body gave when no machine could see them. That lineage lives in Joan, and through her in me. She always told me I had hands that listened. When I was 12, I reset a neighbor kid's dislocated shoulder with nothing but firm pressure and whispered calm. By 16, I was shadowing Joan at the clinic she ran out of her kitchen. By 25, I had a degree, a stethoscope, and a mountain of debt that seemed smaller than my hope. That was before everything fell apart. It started with a patient, an elderly man with a crushed leg from a car accident. His vitals were crashing, and the attending was 20 minutes out. I recognized the signs of a developing embolism, and I knew a field procedure that could stabilize him. It wasn't in the manual, but I did it anyway. He lived, and then he sued. Claimed I'd acted without consent. The hospital distanced itself. The board convened. I was disciplined, then suspended, then erased. They said I broke protocol, but what I really broke was the illusion that only sanctioned knowledge saves lives. That's what terrified them. And so they broke me in return. 3 years later, I was pushing carts in the hospital where I once led surgeries. My badge read orderly. No one looked me in the eyes anymore. But Joan never let me forget who I was. Every night in our cramped apartment overlooking Riverside, she reminded me that healing isn't a job, it's a calling. She brewed teas that chased sleep through my bloodstream, told me stories about her own battles with doctors who laughed at her hands but cried for her help when their medicine failed. Real healers, she'd say, stirring her cup, know when to read a pulse and when to read a silence. It was during one of those silences that I saw her. The television was muted, the late news playing behind a stack of unopened bills. A feature came on, Detroit's Angel. There she was, Stella Vanderbilt, draped in white silk, seated in a pearl-trimmed wheelchair, flanked by servants and cameras. She was everything the world wanted in a tragic heroine. Beautiful, broken, unreachable. Paralyzed from the waist down, they said, after a fall at her private estate. She had donated millions to hospitals and rehabilitation programs, including the very one that had fired me. Joan's teacup paused mid-air. "That woman ain't paralyzed," she said flatly. I frowned. "What makes you say that?" "She's holding her hips too tight, like someone bracing to stand up," she sipped, and her foot just twitched. I looked closer. She was right. Over the next few days, I couldn't get Stella Vanderbilt out of my mind. Something didn't add up. I began watching old interviews, charity galas, award ceremonies. In every one, she sat perfectly still. too still. But in the unedited clips, when she thought the cameras weren't rolling, I saw it. A subtle flex of her toes, a flicker of tension in her thigh, muscles that should have been dormant. Then, one afternoon, I saw her in person. She had come to inspect a property across from the hospital. Rumor was she planned to turn it into a wellness retreat. Her limousine pulled up to the curb. 2 men unfolded her chair. She let them carry her out like glass. But as they stepped away to speak with a contractor, she sat alone for a moment, talking into a phone. I watched from the second-floor break room window. Her voice rose, frustrated. Her shoulders stiffened. And then it happened. Her legs shifted. Not a spasm, a movement. Intentional. I stared in disbelief. Every cell in me awakened. She wasn't paralyzed, or at least not in the way people thought. I had seen this before, in soldiers returning from war, in victims of long trauma. Joan called it soul lock, when the mind shackled the body, trapping it in fear, guilt, or pain. It wasn't faked. It was real. But it wasn't physical. I had to talk to her. That evening, I called in a favor. Sandra, one of the nurses in physical therapy, had once interned at Stella's foundation. She agreed to pass along my name, said she couldn't promise anything. Be careful, she warned. People like that don't like being told what they are. 2 days later, I was outside the rehab wing when I saw her again. The hallway emptied like the Red Sea before her entourage. I stepped forward, blocking her path. "Miss Vanderbilt," I said, quietly. She didn't look up. "I'm Isaac Moore. I believe I can help you walk again." Now her eyes met mine, steel gray, cold and sharp, her lips curled. "You can help me?" she repeated, like I'd said something offensive. "Yes, I believe your condition isn't neurological. I think it's..." She held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there. I've had the top specialists from 5 countries examine me. I've spent 10 years and $15 million on treatments, and you, what? Push beds and think you've cracked the code?" I didn't flinch. "Sometimes it takes someone who isn't trying to sell you a miracle," I said. She studied me, as if deciding whether I was insane or merely stupid. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." "No," I admitted. "But I know how your foot moves when you're angry, and I know what trauma can do when the mind refuses to let go. I've seen it before, and I've helped." For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a shadow. Then it vanished. "You're dismissed," she said coldly, "before I make a call that ensures you'll never work in this city again." I nodded. "I'll leave you with this. You're not broken, but you're hiding, and that chair isn't your prison, it's your shield." I turned and walked away. Behind me, I didn't hear her call security, didn't hear her shout, only silence. But it was a heavy silence, the kind that follows a truth someone wasn't ready to face. Back home, Joan was waiting on the porch. She looked up as I approached, something unreadable in her face. "You did it, didn't you?" she said. "She wasn't ready," I replied. "She will be," Joan said, sipping her tea, "because you saw her chains. And now, so did she." I sat beside her as the sun slipped behind the skyline and the city lights blinked to life, one by one. In that moment, I understood something. Healing doesn't always begin with medicine. Sometimes it begins with confrontation. And sometimes the first hand you have to fix isn't the patient's, and it's your own. 3 days passed, and the silence around me began to change in texture. Not the kind of silence that follows something insignificant, but the thick humming kind that suggests whispers in rooms you're not invited into. When I arrived for my shift at the hospital, I noticed first the sideways glances from staff who once offered me tired smiles in the hallway. Then the shift manager avoided eye contact altogether. That afternoon, they handed me an envelope. Effective immediately, I was suspended. No explanation, just a list of ongoing internal concerns regarding professionalism and boundary violations. I didn't need to ask who was behind it. Stella Vanderbilt had made her move. She didn't shout, didn't confront, didn't bother to refute my words when I challenged her. No, she did what powerful people do when they feel threatened. She pulled invisible levers in invisible offices and made problems appear in other people's lives. That was how she stayed clean, and how people like me disappeared. I left the hospital quietly. No drama, no phone calls. I walked back through the same sliding doors I'd once entered, wearing a white coat, now just another man with no name, carrying a garbage bag of belongings and a face no one wanted to remember. By the time I reached the apartment, Joan was waiting at the window. She didn't ask questions. She only opened the door and handed me a hot cup of tea like she always did. But that night, we didn't speak much. I couldn't. I felt stripped bare. The following morning, 2 city officials showed up for a surprise inspection of our unit. "Routine compliance check," one of them said. They walked through our 2-bedroom apartment like detectives in a crime scene, measured the sink pressure, checked our fire extinguisher expiration date, wrote something down about minor peeling paint near the baseboard. Then they handed us a notice. We had 10 days to correct all violations or risk non-renewal of our housing assistance. Joan chuckled bitterly as they left. "She's trying to bury us," I said, slamming the door. "No," Joan said, calm as ever. "She's trying to disappear us. There's a difference." I paced the living room. "She thinks if I lose the roof over my head, I'll stop. That if she cuts off every path forward, I'll give up." "You won't," Joan said, "because you know something she doesn't want you to know." "What if that's not enough?" Joan put her cup down. "Then it's time to know more." It was Joan who told me to look deeper, not just at Stella, but at the history that created her, because people like Stella weren't made in a vacuum. They were built, piece by piece, generation by generation, on top of something buried. So I started digging. The Detroit Free Library has a basement archive with yellowed newspapers and forgotten documents. I spent hours scrolling through microfiche records and property transactions. Stella Vanderbilt hadn't always been a Vanderbilt. She was born Stella Kowalski, daughter of Polish immigrants in South Chicago. Her father was a machinist, her mother worked in a bakery. They were poor, but not destitute. Stella had been brilliant in school. She won scholarships, attended Northwestern. She interned for political campaigns and eventually caught the eye of Richard Vanderbilt III at a fundraising gala. That was the moment her life changed. Not because she fell in love, at least not the kind of love that leads to honesty, but because she had found her golden ladder. Richard was wealthy, careless, and seeking a wife who looked good on camera. Stella fit the image. She reinvented herself. New name, new voice, new past. Stella Kowalski became Stella Vanderbilt, and she made sure no one remembered the girl who used to fold bread at her mother's bakery. Their marriage lasted 6 years. 1 year before Richard's death, court records showed he'd filed initial divorce paperwork. Irreconcilable differences. He wanted out. That part had never made the news, but it was in the court archives, unsealed and ignored. The day after that filing, Stella was hospitalized. Fall from a balcony, the hospital summary read. Traumatic injury, suspected spinal damage, emergency surgery. Overnight, she became paralyzed. Richard withdrew the divorce filing 3 weeks later. He died 18 months after that of a sudden cardiac event. His entire estate, conservatively estimated at $160 million, 0 cents, went to Stella. The will had been updated shortly after her accident, during his recovery from a minor heart attack. He never left the hospital. The deeper I looked, the more the pieces aligned. Stella's paralysis had conveniently appeared when her marriage was about to end. Her husband's death came conveniently after she secured his fortune, and no one asked questions. Why would they? The story was clean, neat, tragic, and her wheelchair made her untouchable. But I wasn't finished. I remembered something Joan had told me years ago about a woman she'd cared for as a young nurse, Eleanor Vanderbilt, Richard's mother. Joan had been 23, a nurse's assistant at a private clinic. She spoke of Eleanor with a mix of fondness and grim recognition. Eleanor had been dying of advanced stomach cancer. The doctors had given up, but Eleanor didn't die. She recovered. Joan had treated her with old herbal mixtures passed down from her own mother, roots and poultices, pressure work and rituals the doctors scoffed at. Yet, Eleanor improved, enough to return home. 2 months later, Joan was fired. She started walking again, Joan told me now, staring into the distance. No one knew why. They said the chemo must have finally kicked in, but I knew it wasn't that, and so did Eleanor. But she kept her mouth shut, said she didn't want to embarrass her sons. Richard, I realized, had witnessed that recovery. He would have seen what healing outside of medicine looked like, and he would have seen Joan. That's why, when I was born, Joan never told me who she'd worked for. The past is like old dust, she used to say. Sometimes it's better left alone. But I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I found the last surviving doctor from Eleanor's case, Dr. Charles Avery, now 75, living alone in a brick house outside Hamtramck. I knocked on his door one morning with nothing but my name and a bag of fruit Joan had sent. At first, he didn't recognize me, but when I said, "Eleanor Vanderbilt," he turned pale. He invited me in and closed every curtain. "She should have died," he said, sitting down. "We all knew it, but then she just didn't. I remember your aunt. She was the only one who touched Eleanor, like she wasn't already gone. And when Eleanor got better, the family panicked. They made me write a new report. Said, the treatment worked. They paid me to keep it clean." He paused. "And then they paid me again. Years later, when Richard died, that got my attention. I was brought in after his heart attack. He was stable at first. Then something changed. Rapid deterioration, seizures. They said natural causes, but I saw the symptoms. It looked like digitalis poisoning. Classic foxglove. "Did you say anything?" I asked. He nodded slowly. I started to, but then Stella made me an offer, a very generous one, to write a very quiet report. I felt a chill rise in my chest. "Do you still have the files?" Dr. Avery left the room. When he returned, he carried an old leather folder, yellowed with age. Inside were medical reports, private notes, and one document that mattered most. A toxicology summary with trace irregularities marked but unexamined. Someone had scribbled "inconclusive" in red ink, but anyone with experience could read between the lines. "She killed him," I whispered. Dr. Avery didn't respond, but his silence said everything. When I returned home, Joan was waiting in her chair by the window. She didn't ask what I'd found. She just handed me a warm cloth to clean my hands and said, "Now you know what she's hiding behind." I nodded. "It's not the chair. It's the lie." Joan's eyes were steady. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to take away her shield." She smiled faintly. "Good. But don't forget who you are. We don't destroy, Isaac. We reveal. The rest is up to them." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, not just thinking about Stella's lies, but about what they represented. She wasn't just one woman pretending to be broken. She was a symbol of a system that rewards deception, that buries truth under gold-plated sympathy. And I was going to expose her, not because I hated her, but because I had to heal her. And healing, I was learning, begins where denial ends. The morning air felt heavier, as though even the sky was holding its breath. I stood at the kitchen counter stirring oatmeal, not because I was hungry, but because motion kept my hands from shaking. Across from me, Joan sat with her notebook, quietly scribbling in the margins of a decades-old anatomy textbook. Her tea steamed untouched beside her. I had just finished recounting everything I'd learned from Dr. Avery the day before, laying it all bare. Stella's past, Richard's suspicious death, and the forged diagnosis that turned a privileged woman into a public martyr. Joan didn't react right away. She just nodded slowly, her eyes moving along the page as if the truth needed to be read twice to be real. "She killed him," I said again, because saying it aloud still felt surreal. And she paid people to help her do it, to protect her mask. "She didn't just kill him, Isaac," Joan replied without looking up. "She killed who she used to be. That's what made her dangerous." I leaned against the sink, arms crossed, eyes on the window where the city moved in slow silence. Stella hadn't simply buried a man. She had buried a lifetime of lies under grief, pity, and performance. Her body was a stage, and she had turned her wheelchair into a throne. "I'm gonna take her down," I said. Joan's pencil stopped. She looked up. No, baby, you're gonna lift her up. I stared at her. She doesn't deserve. She deserves exactly what the truth gives her. Nothing more, nothing less. But you? Joan's voice softened. You don't get to be her executioner. You get to be what you've always been. A healer. About what if she refuses to be healed? Then you show her. You hold the mirror, and you let her decide whether to look. That night, I sat down at our kitchen table with a legal pad, a USB drive, and a plan. I began gathering every piece of evidence I had. Photos of the court records showing the divorce filing, copies of Richard's will, changes, hospital notes from Dr. Avery, even surveillance footage I'd quietly collected of Stella walking through her garden in the early morning, unaware that her security cameras could be accessed through a loophole in her own foundation's shared system. I hadn't hacked anything. I'd simply observed what her IT consultant had left unsecured. Each folder I compiled wasn't a weapon. It was a diagnosis, a complete case file of a woman who had spent her life curating a fiction so elaborate it had become her truth. Still, something was missing. I needed a witness, someone who had seen her, who had worked for her, who could stand beside my evidence and confirm what I knew. That's when I remembered the name I'd found in a housekeeping invoice from years ago. Marisa Jean Baptiste. She had been Stella's personal housekeeper for 3 years before she was abruptly terminated. A few phone calls later, I found her working at a local elementary school as a janitor. I waited until her shift ended and introduced myself. Miss Jean Baptiste, I said, catching her as she exited with a mop bucket. My name is Isaac Moore. I believe you worked for Stella Vanderbilt. Her face froze, her grip tightened on the mop. I don't talk about that. I know, I said gently. But I also know you saw something you weren't supposed to, and I think she made sure you paid the price. She hesitated, eyes narrowing. What do you want? I want the truth to come out, but I don't want to hurt her. I want her to face what she's become. Marisa was silent for a long time. Finally, she nodded toward a bench near the parking lot. I saw her get up, she said, twice, once at night when she thought no one was around. She reached up to a high shelf in the study. Another time, she danced. Danced? He was listening to old jazz on vinyl, alone. I was cleaning the hallway. She didn't know I was there. She was barefoot, just moving. She shook her head, biting her lip. The next day, I got a notice. They said my contract had expired, but I'd just renewed it the week before. Would you testify? Marisa hesitated. If I do this, I lose my job, maybe more. I understand, I said. But what if I told you I'm not just looking to expose her? I'm looking to free her. She looked at me strangely. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she whispered, but only if I can see her face when she realizes someone finally saw through her. That night, I returned home and told Joan everything. She was quiet, but I could feel the pride behind her stillness. You're doing this the right way, she said. I still don't know what I'll say when I'm standing in front of her. You won't need to, Joan replied. The truth will do the talking. All you have to do is hold the space. We planned everything over the next 2 days. Dr. Avery agreed to be there. Marisa would come. Joan insisted on being present too. Because if that woman's going to meet the truth, she ought to see the face of the one she once dismissed as help. We scheduled the visit for a Sunday morning. Quiet, less staff, fewer interruptions. I dressed plainly. No suit, no drama. Just a gray button-down clean slacks and the satchel that held the entire truth inside. When we arrived at the gates of Stella's estate, the guard didn't even stop us. I'd called ahead the day before, pretending to be a representative from a medical charity she supported. Her assistant confirmed the appointment without asking too many questions. That was her first mistake. The air was cool, the driveway lined with trees, trimmed like they were afraid of growing too freely. We stepped into the marble foyer just as the grandfather clock struck 10. She was already waiting. Stella sat at the center of the room, draped in soft blue cashmere, a single diamond earring glinting in the morning light. Her wheelchair gleamed. She looked older than she had on television, tired but defiant. "I agreed to 20 minutes, she said, not looking directly at me. "State your purpose." I opened my satchel and handed her a manila folder. She opened it slowly. As she read the first page, the court filing showing Richard's original divorce petition, her fingers curled. "This means nothing," she said flatly. "There's more," I replied. I pulled out the toxicology report from Dr. Avery and placed it on the table beside her. "Who gave you this?" she hissed. "I did," came a voice from the hall. Dr. Avery stepped forward. Stella's face went pale. "You?" she whispered. "You're still alive?" "Unfortunately," he said dryly. Behind him, Marissa stepped into the light. "I remember you," Stella said, venom rising. "You're the maid I fired." "No," Marissa said. "I'm the woman who saw you dance." Silence fell over the room like snowfall. Stella turned to me, her voice shaking. "You're orchestrating a circus? For what? Fame? Money?" "I don't want your money," I said. "I want your truth." She laughed bitterly. "What truth? That I fell? That I suffered?" "No," I said, stepping closer. "That you ran, and you've been hiding ever since." I reached into my bag and pulled out the final piece, a small tablet. I tapped the screen. A video began to play. Footage of Stella walking through her garden, reaching for a shelf, dancing, free and alone. Her eyes widened. She tried to grab the tablet, but Joan was faster. She picked it up and placed it firmly in her lap. "You're not the first woman who tried to become untouchable," Joan said softly. "But you might be the first who paralyzed herself to do it." Stella's hand trembled. "Enough," she muttered. "Leave my house." "Then stand up and make us," I said. She didn't move. "You can't," I continued, "because you've forgotten how. But your body remembers, your muscles remember, and your shame won't save you anymore." Something snapped in her then. She stood. Not slowly, not painfully, not with struggle. She stood like a woman who had done it 1,000 times before. Everyone in the room watched, breathless. And in that instant, Stella Vanderbilt wasn't broken. She was exposed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. It only whispered, "Welcome back." But the war was far from over, because what comes after exposure is reckoning. And I was just getting started. The sound her feet made when they touched the marble floor stayed with me for days. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely audible. A soft scrape, a whispered confession from the soles of shoes that hadn't made a sound in public for almost a decade. But to me, it echoed louder than any judge's gavel, because in that instant, all her lies, woven from sympathy, pity, manipulation, collapsed. Stella Vanderbilt stood in her own home, surrounded by the people she had tried to bury beneath her performance, and there was no more curtain to pull shut. She didn't sit down again. Not right away. She simply stood there, frozen, her eyes darting between us like a trapped animal, calculating. She must have known the footage I'd gathered would reach far beyond this room, that once the truth left her marble palace, it would take shape in headlines, in legal proceedings, in the whispered gossip of the rich and powerful. And it did. Within 24 hours, the story was everywhere. Heiress walks again and straight into scandal, paralyzed philanthropist exposed in shocking fraud, local news, national channels, international outlets. Everyone wanted a piece of the fall. The footage made its way to every major platform. I didn't leak it, personally, but I didn't stop the others. Marissa sent a copy to a friend at the Detroit Free Press. Dr. Avery gave an interview to a former student now working at a public radio station. And Joan? Joan handed an envelope directly to the police. It wasn't just about Stella's false paralysis anymore. The investigation dug deeper, peeling away the carefully manicured layers of her life. Financial fraud, insurance deception, forgery of medical records, obstruction of justice. Then the big one, suspicion of homicide. Richard Vanderbilt's exhumed body revealed traces of digitalis, the very substance Dr. Avery had identified, and thanks to the original toxicology report, doctored and signed under pressure, the authorities had a clear timeline of motive, method, and manipulation. She was arrested within the week. I wasn't there when they came for her. I didn't want to be. I had already seen the real moment of justice. It happened in her hallway, under a chandelier she once used to impress donors. She had stood, she had been seen, and she had no place to hide. Everything after that was just paperwork. The courts moved swiftly, perhaps unusually so for someone with Stella's money. But her money was no longer what it had been. Much of her fortune was frozen under asset forfeiture laws once the charges were formalized. Her legal team, high praises, high profile, fought tooth and nail. They tried to argue that she suffered from dissociative neurological illness, that she was not responsible for her actions. But with footage, documents, sworn testimonies, and a former medical collaborator turned witness, there was nothing left to build a lie on. She was convicted on multiple counts, the most severe being first-degree murder. 25 years, no parole. The day the sentence was read, Joan made dinner. Not a celebration, she made that clear, but a commemoration. Collard greens, cornbread, oxtail stew the way her mother taught her. We ate in silence for a long time. Then she raised her glass of sweet tea and said, "To the truth. May it always outlive the lies." It was a toast I'll never forget. What happened next felt like something out of a story too perfect to be real. The government seized Stella's estate and offered portions of it in restitution to the Vanderbilt Foundation's former donors. But not all the assets were claimed. A substantial amount, some of it quietly redirected by Stella herself during her fake philanthropic years, was converted into a public trust. That's when I proposed something that made Joan nearly spill her tea. We turned the mansion into a healing center, I said. Joan blinked. You mean that tomb of marble and gilt? Exactly that one, we reclaim it. At first, the idea seemed ludicrous, but with legal permission and mounting public interest, the plan gained traction. Grants arrived, donations poured in, the scandal had struck a nerve. People were hungry for redemption stories. And so the Vanderbilt estate was transformed. No longer a shrine to false suffering, it became the Joan Moore Center for Integrative Healing. We kept the architecture mostly intact. The columns, the garden, the hallways where deception once walked, but we filled it with different energy. Each room was dedicated to something restorative: physical therapy mixed with traditional herbal treatments, mental health programs that combined modern science and ancestral wisdom. We welcomed everyone, insured, uninsured, rich, poor, especially those who'd been overlooked, ignored, or judged for using remedies not found in textbooks. I was offered money, plenty of it. Media appearances, book deals, consulting offers from universities and private firms. But I turned most of it down, not out of pride, but principle. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. I just wanted to teach people how to see, to read the body the way my aunt had taught me, to listen not just with stethoscopes but with patience, to notice the twitch in a finger, the tightening of a jaw, the shadow in someone's gaze. I did accept one offer, an academic fellowship that allowed me to officially restart the process of reclaiming my medical license. It took another year and a mountain of paperwork, but eventually I received the letter. I was once again Dr. Isaac Moore. But the title didn't change how I treated people. It only helped them trust what they should have trusted all along. The center became more than a clinic. It became a sanctuary. Joan continued to teach, surrounded by students of every age and color. She was in her element, explaining the connection between liver tension and bitterness, or showing how to find inflammation through pulse rhythm. She'd always said her knowledge would die with her if she didn't pass it on. Now she had rooms full of eager minds listening, writing, learning. She was home. And then, one day, I visited the prison. Not because I wanted to see Stella, but because I needed closure. The guard escorted me through 2 sets of steel doors into the visitor center. She was already waiting on the other side of the bulletproof glass. No more silk, no more diamonds. Her hair was pulled back into a limp braid. Her hands, once polished and poised, now fidgeted with a paper cup. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes didn't widen, they didn't narrow, they simply met mine. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse. "I did." "Wait, to make sure you understood." "Understood what?" she asked, almost laughing. "That you won?" "I never wanted to win," I replied. "I wanted you to stop trying to destroy people who could have helped you, who tried to." She looked down. "You were just a child. Compared to everything I controlled, you were nothing." "No," I said. "I was a man who'd seen pain and learned from it. And you were a woman with every advantage, who chose to live inside her own fiction." "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid that if I let go of the lie, there'd be nothing left." "There could have been healing," I said. "But you didn't want that kind of truth. You wanted the kind that made people kneel." She said nothing for a long while. Then finally, her eyes met mine again. "Did it make a difference?" she asked. "Everything you did?" I thought about the students walking Jones halls, the mothers in recovery, the boys learning to see beyond violence, the patients who'd come in hopeless and walked out laughing. "Yes," I said. "It made all the difference." She nodded once. A small, tired gesture. And then she looked away. I stood and left. Outside, the sun was warm, there was no wind, just the smell of possibility in the air. In time, Stella's name became a footnote, a cautionary tale in ethics classes and criminal justice textbooks. The woman who pretended. But the part they always emphasized most was what came after. The transformation, not hers, ours. The center thrived. Programs expanded. We built satellite clinics. We started a scholarship in Richard Vanderbilt's name, not to honor him, but to remind the world that wealth without compassion is worthless, that real medicine requires humility. When reporters asked me for a final quote on the case, I gave them what Joan had once told me. "The most dangerous illness is the belief that your pain makes you better than others. The only cure is truth." And then I went back to work. Because justice isn't a moment. And mine had only just begun. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Share this video with someone who still believes in truth and justice. It might be exactly what they need to see. And if you want more, make sure to watch the next video, another story that proves healing can come from the most unexpected places.